Thanks, Michelle. And thanks, everybody, for coming in and being a part of this conversation today. So, we often think of ourselves as economic agents, as consumers or employees, or maybe as nodes in a complex technology-based society. But after all, we are animals. And as animals, we depend on ecosystems. We Homo sapiens, depend on ecosystems for our food. That's where our building materials come from. That's where our energy comes from. It's ecosystems that provide our water and that recycle and clean that water, that decompose waste, that pollinize flowers and sow our crops. And we also depend on ecosystems for our own renewal, for appreciating that space, for enjoying it. And earth scientists and ecologists have long noted that on Earth, water, energy, and nutrients cycle through complex, multi-layered, interrelated systems. Water cycles through the air, surface and ground. Carbon cycles through microbes, through plants, through herbivores, through carnivores, through scavengers, and back to microbes. These cycles interact. Sometimes we have a dry year. We have a dry year, there are fewer plants, fewer herbivores. The carnivores struggle. Organisms may move, some more die. But then we get a wetter year and we return back to that balance. If we think about human social systems, they also are complex interactive systems. We interact with each other in a lot of ways, sometimes negotiating, working, buying, but also fighting and exploiting. So this interaction is all structured by political, social, economic, and cultural norms and forces. But all these social forces, all of this human system is again dependent on the ecosystem. Just think of ourselves. When you brushed your teeth this morning, that water came from the ecosystem. Similarly, if you think about the energy that you burned in order to get here in this building or to fire up on Zoom, that came from the ecosystem, either more immediately or remotely because of energy that had been fossilized. And in the same way then, as we use these resources, we generate waste. As we flush the toilet, or as that we think about the heat that we dissipate from, like my aluminum frame bicycle that I biked in over here, and that then has to go into the ecosystem. So the Earth's biosphere is a complex, interactive, physical, ecological system that has been resilient to countless perturbations, especially over the last 10,000 years. We've had this Holocene epoch where it has been remarkably stable. Now, scientists have begun to think about the notion of a planetary boundary. That is, how the planet's systems are operating that provide a safe operating space for humanity. So this is the best judgment on where we can count for a little bit of year to year, decade to decade perturbation, but we're going to come back into a place that's in balance and we're thriving. The concern is that human actions have become so profound on ecosystems that we are permanently destabilizing the long-standing resilient Earth systems that the human communities depend upon. So if we think about it, much of health, we've thought about, well, we need to create a just society. So here in global health, we've been thinking a lot about the center of this circle, or the center of what Kate Raworth calls the donut, of donut economics, that we want to be sure that we have a social and economic system that provides the essential water, food, education, all of the things we need for a thriving society. But now we also need to be cautious about overshoot, because of this profound impact of human on the ecology, we risk overshooting the capacity of the Earth to support us, so that we need a new economics that supports the center but doesn't go too far. So planetary health then is a field. It's a field focused on analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruption to Earth's natural system on human health and all life on Earth. It engages climate change, and we all think about climate change, but if you noticed, these concerns are more than just climate change. We're also worried about loss of biodiversity and the integrity of the biosphere. We think about novel entities, chemical pollution. We think about problems with fresh water and biogeochemical flows, all the phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizers that we're dumping into our water systems. So planetary health engages all of this. And if we think about planetary health and the effect that all of these changes has on human communities, it actually can broaden the group of people who are working towards sustainability. So as Michelle mentioned, we now have a Stanford Center for Human and Planetary Health. So this is a center that has 1 foot in the Dorr School of Sustainability and 1 foot right here in the School of Medicine with the Center for Innovation and Global Health. And from this basis, then we're really working to reach out across the whole university to include engineering, business, humanities and science, School of Education, and law. Importantly, there are 4 focus areas within the center, that is climate and health, pollution and health, disease ecology in a changing world. As the world changes, what are the new microbes, and food systems, health, and the environment. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of this, but rather than talk right now about the center and the structure, and we'll come back to this a bit, I really want to focus on what I think are key issues for today. That is, we have a new Center for Human and Planetary Health. This is taking on a great challenge of our time. And what relevance is this for the Department of Medicine? What does this mean? And specifically, how might a human and planetary health framing affect clinical practice? And what are some high-value research areas that we might explore collaboratively? So let's first look at climate and health. So we know, it's in the headlines every day, the world is warming, we're seeing more extreme heat events. 2024 was the hottest year ever. 2023 was also the hottest year ever. CO2 just keeps building up, so we're getting hotter. Well, what does this mean for us as physicians? Well, if it gets too hot, we get to organ failure. So we need to also be, just like the ecology needs to be in homeostasis, so does the body. Also with extreme heat, there's more floods and droughts and lower crop yields. In addition, with higher temperatures, we get more surface ozone formation, and we get changes in vectors. For example, the vectors for dengue moving into California. And also increases of conflict with climate change. So if we look across, this is 12 cities over the course of 27 years. You see a similar pattern. Maybe we can focus here in the top upper right corner in the UK, as either if temperatures are very cold or if it gets very hot, mortality increases. And that's not just true in the UK, that's just true all over. When it gets hot, mortality increases. People die. Well, who dies? Well, first, let's say what's going on the individual. So first, at high temperatures, we dilate our blood vessels, and so increases blood flow to the skin for cooling. This risks central hypovolemia if you shift too much blood to the surface, and so decrease stroke volume, increase contractility, heart rate, and cardiac strain. So this can progress to dehydration if you shift so much fluids peripherally. with decreased blood pressure, ultimately splanchnic ischemia, decreased sweating, hyperthermia, heat stroke, and death. The organism cannot survive at high internal temperatures. So who are the folks who are at highest risk? Well, overwhelmingly, it's older adults. Older adults have diminished capacity to shift blood flow to the skin, and they're less able to increase cardiac contractility, heart rate, and stroke volume. They're the ones at increased risk. Not only that, the medications that they're on, beta blockers, diuretics, and others, reduces the capacity for them to respond to these high heat. So if we look at those heat-associated deaths, overwhelmingly, these are deaths from cardiovascular stress in older adults. It's not the only effect that heat has. Heat also affects our sleep. Kelton Minor got hold of anonymous data on folks who were wearing sleep trackers and activity trackers across 68 countries, over 47,000 adults, and 7.4 million nighttime sleep records. It's a lot of data. And what he sees is a very clear pattern. The higher the temperature, the less sleep. And you might look at this and say, oh, well, look, it's only about 20 minutes less sleep. So we have a little bit less sleep, but these are also on population levels. And again, people over the age of 65 experience twice as much lost sleep per 1 degree increase in temperature than their middle-aged adults. So again, we're seeing a high-risk population. And okay, so what's so bad about a little lost sleep? Well, reduced cognitive performance. I think we've all felt that with lost sleep. Worse executive function, diminished productivity, increased absenteeism, increased motor vehicle crashes, increased incidence of depression, increase of metabolic syndrome, and increased mortality. So it's not good on a population level that people are not getting much, that people's sleep is impaired. In the day before of Doji and X, there was Twitter and tweets. So Marshall Burke took 622 million geolocated tweets, 2014, 2015 data, and looked particularly at depressive tweets. So depressive tweets are tweets that have words like addictive, alone, bleak, depressed, severe, suicidal, trapped, and then tracked those across mean monthly temperature. And what you see is the hotter it gets, the more depressive tweets there are. Now you might say, why does he have 6 different lines rather than 1? That's just something economists do. They never just have one model. Well, it's this model or that model. Then you might also ask, what is a CBSA? That's a core-based statistical area, what we physicians would call a city. But the pattern is clear. As the weather gets warm, more depressive words included in tweets. Okay, well, depressive tweets. Should we worry about this? Well, if we then look at suicide rates in the US over 36 years, and you're doing it the same month, same season, same time of year, just looking at difference in temperature, what we see is that suicide rates increase at higher temperatures. And this is not just a US phenomenon, same thing we see in Mexico. So when weather's warmer, deaths by suicide increase. So then as we think about what does an internist do? How can we help patients cope with a warming planet? Well, first, let's identify patients at high risk. So this is elderly, patients with cardiovascular disease, patients with depression, people who are outdoor workers, and the unhoused. We can think about suggesting strategies to cool off. One step is to develop a heat wave plan. I am not a seer, but I can tell you we will have hot weather this summer. And we will have hot weather next summer. Heat waves are coming. They're going to be more frequent. So we should work with our patients to develop a heat wave plan. And part of this is connecting them with others. It's isolated people living alone, don't have family nearby, not connected to the community. Those are the ones who are dying. So this is not a time to save money. They have air conditioning, use it. Urge them to leave home if it gets too hot and during power outages. And a good place to go are neighborhood cooling centers. These are characteristically open. You can go to libraries, you can go to various places, but a big part of this is having that plan. And then think about ancillary strategies, encouraging hydration, encouraging good sleep hygiene, check that medications are optimized, and do a mental health check-in as well. So what are some productive areas for research on heat and health? Well, if we just think about it from the planet's perspective, it turns out that the amount of greenhouse gas generated by healthcare itself is actually quite high. And it is growing. It is growing both in terms of the amount of CO2 emissions over time and the percent of the US total. Indeed, if the US healthcare sector were itself a country, it would rank 13th in the world, ahead of the entire UK in terms of its greenhouse gas footprint. So how do we reduce this footprint? What might we do here at Stanford? Well, fortunately, there's a big group at the Sustainability Program Office, headed by Helen Wilmot, that is really working in this area. And they've got 5 areas where they're particularly focusing on: greenhouse gas emissions, energy management, waste prevention, water conservation, and chemicals of concern. So anyone who is interested in thinking about using Stanford as a living laboratory about how we can do better, the C-suite has invested in Stanford being a leader in this area. There are ways that you can work to improve Stanford, and I would argue work to be a model and work for us to develop new knowledge about how to change this globally. So there are other issues on what we can do to reduce heat, breaking our addiction to fossil fuel, reducing the urban heat island effects. And I want to turn again to patients. So for patients, it would be useful for us to delineate the effects of both episodic heat and chronic exposure on the pathophysiology of illnesses writ large, be those cardiac, neurologic, psychological, endocrinological. And then thinking, if we understand the pathophysiology, what are the implications for prevention and for pharmacology, and generate evidence to guide sound advice. How to stay cool, absent air conditioning, when do you leave home, how do you work outside safely, how do you exercise safely, and how do we improve sleep, especially on hot nights. So we've talked about climate change. I can't do all of human and planetary health in one grand round. So let me talk about a couple more here. Let's talk about biosphere integrity. I want to go back 10,000 years. 10,000 years is actually not that long ago, not if we think about either all of humanity or certainly life on Earth. But if we go back just 10,000 years ago and consider the weight of all vertebrate animals, humans accounted for about 1% of that weight, and wild animals were 99%. But if we look at it today, humans account for 32%. Our livestock, that is those animals we're planning to eat, count for 67%, and only 1% is wild animals. And so this is the reason why we have a huge crisis in biodiversity, because we have taken away natural ecosystems and are instead growing animals so that we can eat their flesh and their milk. So humans have altered 75% of the Earth's land surface, most of that is habitable. And we're just raising more and more of these animals. So if we think about, as the FAO talked about livestock's long shadow, livestock production appropriates 30% of the land surface of the planet and 80% of all agricultural land. And the big one here is cattle. Cattle are at almost 25%. The deforestation of the Amazon is among the greatest environmental tragedies of our time. Now, if we take a look at this from a systems perspective, and human and planetary health likes a systems perspective, the single largest driver of Amazon deforestation, it's not wood for buildings, it's raising cattle for the international market. So this is a low production system where forests are burned to seed nutrients into the soil. Grasslands then are usually productive for only a few years, and the lands are then abandoned and more forest cut down. And who are the biggest importers of Brazilian beef? Oh, Americans. Chinese and the Russians also were big importers. So if we think about this differently and think about what could we do by taking these lands that are being used to raise livestock and let them revert to or encourage them to become, again, a natural ecology. So Hayek and colleagues model 3 different diets. They assumed the freed up pastures were restored into native grasslands and forests between 2015 and 2050. And what you see is business as usual, we're releasing gigatons of CO2, but with a 70% meat reduction, marked reduction, it actually pulls carbon dioxide out of the air and brings it into the new grasslands and the forests, and even more so with a vegan diet. Indeed, this would be equivalent to 16 years of global fossil fuel emissions, and thereby markedly increasing the probability of limiting warming. So people tend to think about, oh, well, we need to get off of our fossil fuel addiction. Yes, we absolutely do. But here is a strategy that we can both improve biodiversity and also capture carbon and help to keep us a little cooler. So that's what's happening on the Earth. What does it mean for us, for people, to be eating this meat? So if we compare the highest meat consumers with the lowest, this is 148 prospective studies, what you see is for red meat, people who eat red meat are much more likely to have endometrial cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, rectal cancer, hepatocellular carcinoma. If we look at processed meat, we see similar patterns. If anything, the confidence limits are narrower. So processed meats are like salami and bacon, those kinds of things. So that's where we're sitting in terms of the malignancy perspective. But Ewan's in the audience, so I thought we'd also talk about some other diseases too. Maybe cardiovascular disease, similarly, increased risk with unprocessed and processed red meat. And this is a meta-analysis, 4.4 million people, increased coronary heart disease, stroke, heart failure, and type 2 diabetes. So if I were to summarize the last few slides on biodiversity and health, it would be with this image. So what do? For clinical implications, physicians should encourage patients to adopt a healthy plant-forward diet. It's good for the patient's own health, and it's good for the health of future generations. Let's think about some productive research areas, developing and evaluating strategies to move patients to adopt plant-forward diets, continued evaluation of diets and health outcomes, and how might the wider use of GLP-1 agonists create opportunities for healthier diets? And which diets optimize palatability, personal health, planetary health? We'll do one more. We'll do novel entities. Novel entities, or I like to think of this as, they used to call it chemical pollution, a little easier to understand, but they're also not thinking about biological entities and other things we put out. So it turns out that chemical pollution, chemistry is just everywhere. Over 95% of manufactured goods rely on chemistry. Look at all these chemicals in an office chair. And this is a huge industry, over $5 trillion in revenues in 2024. So this is a big actor. And they produce over 350,000 industrial chemicals that are registered and used around the world in the global market. A lot of chemicals are used that aren't registered, and of these 350,000, only a small fraction have actually been rigorously evaluated. So the United Nations Environmental Program summarizes hazardous chemicals are ubiquitous in humans and the environment. So I'm going to summarize the effects of 350,000 chemicals. No, I'm actually not going to. There are too many. How am I even going to think about this? I'll just give one example. Let's look at pesticides, one group of chemicals. So scientists in Germany did a systematic measurement of flying insects over the course of 27 years, from 1989 to 2016. They were working in nature-protected areas in a human-dominated landscape. So you can see this is a farm here, and they're collecting their flying insects here. These were nature preserves, water protection zones, various habitats. And you can see they collected both in East Germany and West Germany. You can see in the yellow there the insect traps. So what did they find? What they found was, over the course of 27 years, there was a 76% decline in insect biomass. Just think about the biodiversity loss here, a 76% decline. And how is this? Well, modern pesticides are so potent that even when present at the levels of regulatory thresholds, invertebrate biodiversity is decreased by 30%. I remember driving across the US in the summertime, and we'd have to stop to clean the windshield because of all the bugs. No, it's an insect apocalypse. We have driven these insects overwhelmingly over just 27 years, marked reduction. This is not just a problem in Germany, it's just that the Germans have studied this very well over a long time. So then let's think about cascading effects in ecosystem. What depends on insects? Well, birds depend on insects. So now we're looking at the Netherlands, and this is concentrations of imidacloprid in water bodies in the areas. And so this is a neonicotinoid pesticide thought to have less environmental impact than earlier pesticides. And as they looked over the course of 6 years, looking at songbird species across the Netherlands, what they find is at concentrations greater than 20 nanograms per liter, bird populations are decreasing by 3.5%. Doesn't really surprise me. We said we're all part of an interconnected system, and we've now undercut their main food supply. So there are many different pesticides, organochlorines. Organochlorines work by nervous system disruption. It results in convulsion and paralysis and insect death. Organophosphorus blocks nerve impulses across the synapse, rapid twitching of voluntary muscles, insect paralysis and death. So what happens when people get exposed to this? So I'm looking at some data from Sweden, where they enrolled 989 men and women at age 70. And they measured concentrations of 3 common organochlorine pesticides in the blood. So these weren't agricultural workers. These weren't unusual people. They just took folks at age 70, enrolled them, and they measured their pesticides. And then they followed them 10 years and regularly assessed how they were doing cognitively at a special dementia care unit. The analysis focused on those who maintained or gained body weight, because organochlorine pesticides tend to get stored in the fat, so that if you lose weight, you actually release those pesticides, and if you gain weight, you pull them out. So they focused on those who maintained, people who didn't lose body weight. So compared with the people in the lowest 25th percentile of organochlorine concentrations, those in the 25th to 75th were 6.9 times more likely to develop cognitive impairment. And those above the 75th percentile, 11.6 times more likely to develop cognitive impairment. I mean, I think the magnitude of these effects are shocking, particularly because this is just a general population. But in some sense, does this surprise us? You take a neurotoxin and you put it into people's diets and blood, guess what? It's not so good for us. Or we can look at Parkinson's disease in Colorado, looking at 4 soluble pesticides, and this is groundwater level. So you can see in Denver, they don't have as much of these pesticides as compared to the outlying rural areas. And what do we find when they geolocated health data for over 300,000 Medicare beneficiaries? Every 1 microgram per liter increase in pesticide increased the risk of Parkinson's by 3%. So populations in these highest pesticide area had a 200% increase in the risk of Parkinson's. Again, I'm not surprised. Take a neurotoxin and what effects is it going to have on key neurons in the brain over long times? So there are lots of other diseases associated with pesticide exposure. I focused on the neurological, but they also cause a variety of other malignancies. And then again, pesticides are only one of a few hundreds of thousands of industrial chemicals released into the environment every day. Big problem. So how do we help patients reduce their exposure? Well, there are some things simply we can do. Avoiding plastic bottles and filtering drinking water, washing hands before eating, rinsing produce before eating, microwave and ceramic or glass, not plastic, so you don't move those chemicals into your food. Use baking soda and water or vinegar in place of chemical cleaners. You got to vacuum with a HEPA filter. You can also think about the environmental working groups, Dirty Dozen, the 12 produce items that have the highest level of pesticide, and maybe think about those are ones that are really good investments for organic. So what are productive areas for research on chemical exposure and health? Health consequence of chemical exposure, consider the newer chemicals, chemical combinations, the strategies for accurately clarifying exposure. 2 studies I showed you, I like them because they just did such a good job of assessing exposure over time, and that allows us to draw inference. Which chemicals are of greatest concerns, particularly new ones, and how can we reduce exposures? So my interim conclusion here is that a human and planetary health framing highlights the links between a healthy planet and healthy people. And it also clarifies that planet-damaging practices are not sustainable. We are on a trajectory of self-destruction. This is not a good train to be on. Realizing a healthy, sustainable future is a great challenge of our time. These are human-created problems. Humans created these problems, so we humans can come together and solve them. And in order to do that, we need some help from the School of Medicine. And I want to highlight particularly there are immediate areas for clinical care, increase awareness of evolving environmental threats, and advising patients on steps they can take to promote their health and the health of the planet. Patients also are interested in having a healthier world for their children and their grandchildren. For research in human and planetary health, we need to be solution-oriented because the crisis is so huge, and physicians tend to be pragmatic, solution-oriented folks when they're working with data. And there are lots of folks working in human planetary health, engineers, ecologists, economists, climate scientists would really benefit from medical collaboration. So really want to strengthen these connections. So I urge you to join the Human and Planetary Health Affiliate Program. We'll make the slides available. This affiliate program is the backbone of the dynamic and interdisciplinary community that's contributing expertise. And joining allows networking, leadership opportunities, recognition, and visibility. And I want to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do in the Center for Human and Planetary Health. Our vision here is thriving ecosystems and healthy communities worldwide. Our mission is to create knowledge, prepare leaders, and drive impact in human and planetary health. So we want to do this by driving solution-oriented research. There are a lot of folks out there characterizing the problem. We're biased towards solution-oriented research. We want to prepare future leaders. This is a big problem. We've been working on it for a long time. We need to continue to lean in. We need to get bright young people engaged. We want to accelerate impact by engaging with stakeholders. So that includes affected communities, as well as policymakers and the private sector. And we want to build our community at Stanford. We need to come together to get that secret sauce of interdisciplinary thinking to help us advance these issues. I also want to call out for clinical training this case study resource put together by the Center for Innovation and Global Health, a lot of Michelle's leadership, with the University of Washington's School of Medicine. This provides case studies for training and other resources. There's the QR code and the link. And there are other ways to get involved too. You can join a steering committee, lead a working group, or engage in education. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Luby. We'll open up for questions, and I'm scanning online as well. So folks here in the room, questions? Anyway, yes.
Hi, thank you. That was fantastic. I noticed that you have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and I'm wondering, I will reveal my bias. I am a philosopher. In your talk, I kept thinking, what is the extent to which that has affected your career trajectory in terms of what you have chosen to work on and also what you plan to continue to choose to work on?
Yeah, philosophy has really been central to my thinking and continues to be a frame in which I look at many issues in the world, both in terms of what do we work on, the core values of social justice, and also, frankly, a lot of the epistemology, which is really important, is what do we know, what don't we know, how do we go forward? So, so yes, and actually I continue to read. I still spend some time reading original philosophy because I think it's just super helpful. And I think that also speaks to the interdisciplinary notion and the interdisciplinary value, or the value of interdisciplinary engagement with these issues. So yeah, I use it a lot.
Okay, sorry, one question over here. I know I sound like a broken record. I'm always the one that asks about climate change and AI, but I'd love to hear your take on the large amount of energy it takes to generate AI compared to regular.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really important trade-off that we need to consider, and is a huge problem. I mean, there are a number of concerns around AI. AI is a new and potent technology, so I think we as society need to have a really thoughtful philosophical conversation around what is the role that AI should play, and should this just be led by tech entrepreneurs in terms of what we do. Now, recently the Chinese have released a less energy intense model. I think there's still lots going on in this space. I think that there is an immediate climate threat. On the other hand, there are some ways that maybe this could help in some dimensions. I think that we need to be deeply engaged, and we need a carbon tax. We need to change the incentives in terms of shifting towards cleaner energy.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciated it. I was wondering if you have worked or are planning to work with the Stanford Farm to start initiatives at Stanford and in the surrounding areas.
So Natalie's in the room. Natalie Lambrecht is a postdoctoral scholar in human and planetary health, and her work is on integrative agricultural systems. We have a focus area on food and health, and so Christopher Gardner gave grand rounds a few months ago. There's a lot of dynamism around the issues of food and planetary health. And yeah, I think that there is enthusiasm for thinking about how does the Stanford farm provide a platform for education. Yep.
Steve, congratulations on the center, and thanks for coming to Grand Rounds and giving a talk. This is absolutely terrifying.
It's terrifying.
Just an observation. Solution-oriented research sounds great, but can you speak a little bit to the different levels of solution? I mean, you spoke really nicely in your talk to the fact that we take a very individualistic view as physicians to the patient in front of us, but these are planetary scale problems. Right. How do you think about the multi-scalar nature of the kinds of solutions that a center at an academic university can bring?
Thanks, Ewan. First, I think you're right, it is terrifying. And so I think it's really a call to take this very seriously. And my view, and there's no panacea that's going to take care of it like this. Like, one of the things that we're really benefiting from is the drop in the price of solar. Just dropped remarkably over 400 times. But this is bigger than energy. There are many dimensions to this. So I think that what we need to do is to get people in the room together and thinking about what they can bring and how that can help, and what are the various pieces that come together. For example, I'm working, doing a bunch of work in South Asia on how bricks are made, and are there ways that we can make bricks? And we've done a randomized control trial and demonstrated that if we get people to adopt altered practices, they can bake 100,000 bricks with 23% less coal consumption. So that doesn't eliminate all coal, but it is a step towards reduction. And I think that there are, if you look at what Helen Wilmot's group is doing around what is Stanford's footprint and what can we do, and as I think about the clinician-patient interface, especially around healthy diets, I think that we can increasingly come up with ways that get us in the right direction. And part of it is that then it encourages our hope. They say, oh, look at this. We are making some progress. All right, what else can we do? So I'm for all scale, all hands on deck. Let's lean in.
Steve, thank you as always. There are many residents in the room, as well as practicing clinicians. And many of us have been trying to change how we take the social history in order to add environmental risks. Can you share a little bit about how residents and practitioners can go about doing this?
Yeah, so you've really been with the case study work, you've really been pushing on a social and environmental history, and then leveraging that history to help patients connect, to help clinicians connect with what's going on. So improving differential diagnosis, but also allows one to think about where are we in terms of solution orientation and so prevention orientation. So yeah, I'm a strong supporter of including social and environmental history. And that's also asking physicians to become even more literate about the environmental stresses, because those are important both in terms of understanding what the patient is dealing with and also thinking about, well, then what are the ways we can work towards prevention? Yeah.
Good morning. I was kind of, excuse me, thinking about like our current political landscape and how it intersects with the work that's being done here. And I was wondering if, given everything with like the NIH and the reallocation of funds towards steering away from different like sustainability initiatives, kind of bouncing off the question of like solutions and that hands-on approach you mentioned, how do you think that this may set people back or kind of alter the most effective mechanisms by which we go about improving these issues over the next 4 years? What effect do you think that will have on like the progress that's been made and then the progress we could continue to make in the area?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, these are really difficult times. This is a real devastating setback, a setback against science, a setback to focus on vulnerable populations, a setback on the environment. I worked for 17 years for CDC. I'm really glad that Stanford's my employer right now. And that when I think about, Michelle mentioned I have a book coming out on theories of change in global health. This is not a time when healthy regulations is going to be a leading theory of change in the US. This is not a time when external aid from the US is going to be a great theory of change. But the book has 15 theories of change. So it means we've got to work on the other 13. The other thing, we are enormously benefited by having private philanthropy supporting some of our work. And so I think it's a really important time for us to be very creative about figuring out how we go forward. My colleagues who remain in the federal government, many of them are very demoralized by this, and they're not able to articulate a way forward. They're not able to speak to say, this is what we need to do. It's really important for Stanford. It's really important for the academy to be encouraging young people, to be demonstrating that there is a way forward, and to continue to put one foot in front of the other. So I think this is a really, yes, it's a difficult time. I think we're going to need more creativity, but I think our role is just central.
Steve, along those lines, what's happening in medical education? It sounds from your talk as if virtually every class and could use a climate angle, but are we doing that? And are we really preparing people?
I think that there's increasing effort to integrate climate into the curriculum. Michelle has been much more involved in that than I have, but I think that and when I talk to medical students, they are super interested in this interface. So yes, I think that I think Stanford has been leaning in on that, and there's more to do. And again, I think climate is super important, but I also think planetary health is bigger than climate in terms of the risks we face.
Sorry, I just wanted to go, we have actually a number of questions online as well, and then I'll come back in person. But this is a question from Dr. Gibbs. Would you please say a few words about impact on reproductive health?
Oh, okay, a few words. How about 2 words?
Sorry, yeah.
Not good. I mean, particularly if you look at impact on chemicals and the chemicals in daily use, the endocrine disruptors, there are real big concerns about what we have put into what we call the chemisphere and how that affects reproductive health. Yeah, so I would say big issues there, particularly around chemical exposure. And really hard, and one of the things that's so hard about the chemicals is that they are largely invisible. And so what we need to do is to think about ways that we can make the invisible visible. And are there ways that we can develop technologies that can make us see this? So I've got a line of work around lead exposure in Bangladesh, and actually across South Asia, where this invisible toxin is causing so much damage, both in terms of reproductive health, but more generally. So a lot of our effort is focused on making it more visible.
Thank you. One more question from Dr. Kim. Thank you very much for this talk, and especially in hearing about the schools collaborating. And the question was, is the program in architecture students, is that group involved? It seemed that there was some overlap among medicine and architecture.
Yeah, they're standing up a Sustainable Societies Institute. And that Sustainable Societies Institute will be working a lot on healthy buildings and in a healthy built environment. So yes, this is clearly under the capacious efforts of sustainability at Stanford.
Thanks, Steve. That was an amazing and terrifying talk. So you started with a bunch of correlations, and you pointed out that there's too many to actually mention that correlations with health. I think you've also set out an argument that's so convincing that anybody who listened to it, who was rational and would immediately change. But the 3 correlations you didn't mention, I don't know if you have information on them, that it seems to be bigger impediments One is the level of misinformation. So people who are willing to not act in their own behalf. The second is socioeconomic and influence disparity, which relates to the previous one. And the other one that nobody seems to talk about is that a lot of these problems would be mitigated with if there was a vastly decreased population rather than an increased population. So I don't know, did you come across any correlations between those factors and health, both population size overall and also population density?
Yeah, so misinformation, a big problem, a big well-known problem. And I think generating sufficient social trust for meaningful communication on a societal level is really difficult in the days of social media. But physicians are our superpower. Clinicians one-on-one, your patients trust you. This is an enormous opportunity to help people move in healthier ways and in pro-social ways. So, and I'm not personally willing to engage with people who are disingenuous, who are trying to argue for something on a political grounds, or like the way the fossil fuel companies have bought out the current administration. There's no point to me in having a conversation with people who are using argument just to score points, not in a sort of a truth-seeking kind of place that we try to cultivate at a university. Yeah. No, I mean, no, this is out there. I agree this is out there. And I think the population issue is important in terms of population size does impact planet, though it's actually techno-capitalism and the increasing damage per person that is our biggest constraint. And in the vast majority of countries, populations are dropping. So I think that's not, I don't think that's a central issue as we start to think towards the end of the century.
Hi, thank you so much for your detailed talk. I was wondering, given that you showed a lot of different data about planetary health and about the environment, I was wondering, are there good data sources you could point us toward, whether that's looking at Stanford specifically, California, the US, or like worldwide, where we can better track our progress toward improving, like lowering the risks of certain diseases or reducing carbon emissions? Is there some kind of central data or metrics for that?
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is one of my great concerns about what's going on with the pulling back of federal data sources. So I think that we are increasingly depending on places like the UN environmental groups. I even think about the remote satellites, saying which of those are not run by NASA, so can't get shut down. I mean, I think this is a huge concern, and is even something. Yeah. Short answer to your question is no. We don't have a good centralized, robust data source, but there's a lot of people out there who care a lot about this and are working on this and are thinking about what are the data that we should curate and what might we make globally available so that we can help people throughout. And what might an institution, say, like Stanford, do with some of its data, particularly at a time when federal data is harder to come by?
I loved your talk, but I heard something where you were just going to give up on the new political order. There is one individual in the new political order who I really intensely dislike, but he has said some things that maybe you could help leverage. One of his targets is he uses the same thing, McDonald's hamburger, and he really wants to go after big food. And is there a way you guys can help him succeed?
No, I think this is a great point, that we have to be pragmatic in these times in terms of figuring out whom we can work with to advance this agenda. So I don't think this is a time when we can say, no, we're not going to do anything with big oil because of all of the damage they've done. We're not going to do anything with certain politicians because they make us nauseous when we look at their at their portraits. I think we need to say, how do we get from where we are to where we need to be? And I think we have to be willing to work with difficult partners. So it's a really important point.
All right. We're at the top of the hour now. Thank you so much, Dr. Luby, for that wonderful talk and for this discussion. And yeah, and the recording will actually be available as well in terms of the slides, as a number of people have asked about that. Lastly, please join us next week for Grand Rounds. It'll be downstairs in LK 130 with Dr. Sanjeev Chopra. Thanks so much. Have a great week.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.